Hi everybody, today we're going to take a look at one of the more controversial aspects of Midjourney, namely realism and the bending of documentation through photography. To me, this is an area that has a lot of creative potential and unlocks the door to some really interesting creative techniques, so I do think it's worth exploring. So we'll be looking at how to use Midjourney to recreate some of the most famous photographs in history, as well as creating photos from historical events from a different angle. And again, most importantly, we're going to be looking at some techniques to make everything look a little more authentic. So the gap between Midjourney and reality has been blurring more and more every day. I think the most recent example being the Pope in the Puffy Jacket image that went viral a little while back. And on the opposite side of the religious spectrum, there were some images of kids at SatanCon in Boston that caused a bit of an uproar, enough so that the Associated Press actually had to issue a statement about it. I mean, to me, both images are hilarious, but I will also admit to having a pretty warped sense of humor. More interestingly, though, was a project that I ran across by Michael Christopher Brown, who is a legit award-winning National Geographic photographer. There's no question that Michael has photographed some stunning images, but his latest project, 90 Miles, which documents the 2022 mass exodus from Cuba, has caused quite a bit of a stir. And you can probably guess why. On the origins of the project, Michael said, "I explored documenting the story in a variety of ways while on the ground, though due to the secrecy and trust necessary to the planning and departure from Cuba, found access to be impossible, as any documentation may have jeopardized the safety of those planning, undertaking, or in any way associated with the crossing." Considering himself a visual storyteller, Michael was undeterred by the method of image capture and instead utilized Midjourney. If a photograph of Cubans arriving in Florida on a raft is on the front page of the New York Times this morning, it will, of course, generate awareness, but may likely be forgotten by the next morning, as we've seen these pictures for decades. But when we create stories in new ways and are, of course, clear with our methodology, it may help people see the story in a fresh way, enough that it creates further conversation. Now, to be clear, Michael's images were never intended for news publication, but rather as a storytelling device to bring awareness to the plight of these people. But obviously, it caused a bit of a ruckus, especially considering his pedigree as a photojournalist. So all of that got me thinking, ethics aside, how does Midjourney fare as a documentarian? Can it recreate or even recontextualize historical images? And how would it fare against some of the masters of photography? Well, I think with a little elbow grease, it does really, really well. Let's take a look at that starting with a lunch break. I think most of you know this photo, titled Lunch Atop a Skyscraper. It was taken on September 20th, 1932 by an unknown photographer during the construction of the building that is now 30 Rockefeller Center. Unfortunately, the identity of most of these men has been lost to time. We know the names of about 3 of them, including this lunatic at the end that is holding a bottle. And I can guarantee you that is not a bottle of water. He was eventually identified as Gustav Popovic, as after his passing, this photo was found in his house with the following written on the back: "Don't you worry, my dear Mariska. As you can see, I am still with bottle." Cheers to you, Gustav. Now let's go take a look at recreating this image in Midjourney and see how it does. I started by running a describe on the image, /describe, and ended up with the 4 generated prompts. The images were okay. I mean, it got the idea of it, but not the composition. In some cases, things got a little bit surreal, which actually I really kind of like these. I think they're really cool. Again, not what we were looking for in terms of recreating a photo, but a cool image nonetheless. There was another set where we went completely to the other side of the world. I kind of appreciate that. Mostly I would consider the describe outputs to be a strikeout. So I decided to take a new approach by taking the actual photograph, running it as an image prompt, taking some elements from the describe descriptions, and then just being a little more straightforward in my prompt in the front end, where I just said construction workers on the ledge of a building, and ran it, and we got these images. Of which I thought the third one was probably the most workable, so I upscaled that and then brought it into Photoshop. And just as a quick FYI, if you want to follow along, but you don't have a copy of Photoshop, there are alternatives available. I went over them in the Midjourney Photo Bash video that I did. That link will be below. Very briefly, you could check out Affinity Photo, which is about $100, and it's a one and done thing. There's no subscription to it whatsoever. On the free side, there is a software you can download called GIMP. It's open source photo and imaging, editing, and manipulation. It's been around forever. It's really great. great. And then lastly, if you just want to handle everything online, there is a website called Pixlr. The links to everything will be down below. One of the things that I noticed that was kind of off about this is that the colors are wrong. Despite it being a black and white photo, this does have more of kind of a brownish sepia tone. So one of the things you can do in Photoshop is just come up to image adjustments and then over to match color, and then you can actually match the overall color spectrum of your original image to your Midjourney image. So just within a click of a button. Now, to be completely honest, I did spend a couple of more minutes playing around with the exposure and the black level, the white level, and a couple of other things. But ultimately, I did think that we did get more or less in the ballpark of the same overall color palette of the original. There's obviously a lot more problems, like the textures of the buildings in real life are much better than the ones here, and ultimately the characters do look kind of bland. My trick for this is just to actually take a texture, like an old photo texture, and just pop it on top of it and just kind of messy the whole thing up a little bit, which I think helps sell the image a bit. By doing so, you just grab if you Google photo texture, you'll find something that looks like this, and then you can just set your opacity mode to something like color burn or multiply, and just kind of play around with the various models, and you'll find something that you like. The ultimate problem with this photo is, of course, the characters. I mean, they are just sort of sad, bland blob AI people. Whereas in the original photo, these guys are characters. If you just spend time looking at their faces, they're such characters, especially Gustav. Look at him. Look at Gustav. Amazing. There actually is a workaround for the sad blob people here, and we're going to take a look at that in just a minute. But first, we're going to move over to another famous photograph and take a look at a very surprising Midjourney output there. This is one of the most famous photos in American history. Taken by Dorthea Lange in 1936, this is Migrant Mother, which has become an icon to represent the Great Depression. Lange found the mother and her children pretty much by accident. She was driving home on a cold and rainy March day in 1936 and passed by a sign that said Pea Pickers Camp. She kept driving but couldn't get the thought of the sign out of her head, so she ended up turning around and driving back 20 miles. One of the most interesting aspects to me is the fact that this is actually one of 6 images, and I think this sort of relates in a weird kind of way to Midjourney. Bear with me here. Lange was a documentary photographer and preferred to capture moments in time without any sort of intervention or direction. Lange's first 2 images are kind of at a wider angle and from a distance, and she realized that it lacked any kind of central focus. So she began to hone in on the mother and her child. In the 3rd and 4th image, which I actually can't show you in full because she's breastfeeding in it, and we live in a stupid world, what can I tell you? You can go to Wikipedia and see the images uncensored if you would like. Anyhow, the mother is nursing her child. Lange sensed a sense of shame and embarrassment from the mother's gaze and realized that this was not the image to capture. In Lange's 4th and 5th image, she tried a different technique in having one of the children come around to the mother's side and rest her chin on the mother's shoulder. But with 2 small changes, Lange elevates the photo into the icon that it is today, simply by moving the camera to the other side of the mother and then directing both children to look away from the camera, thus avoiding competing gazes to the viewer. We now have Migrant Mother. The takeaway on the Midjourney side, for me at least, is that you're probably not going to get your best image off your first prompt. You should always be kind of experimenting with your prompt, trying out different, camera shots and angles, and really honing in on the image that you're looking for. Just keep experimenting and trying, and eventually you'll find something great. So once again, using Describe, we run Migrant Mother. Interestingly, in option 2, Dorthea Lange actually comes up as a prompt. So it definitely identifies Dorthea Lange as the photographer of this image. The results were interesting. This one looks a little on the Hollywood glossy side to me. And this one, while beautiful, is not at all what we were looking for. But what is interesting is when I ran the Describe prompt that called out Dorthea Lange and ended up with these images, which, yes, are super surreal. The kids are actually looking forward and they're not kids, they're just clones of the mother. Super weird. But it's very, very close to what the actual photograph is. So once again, taking the Migrant Mother photo and using it as an image prompt and cribbing some lines from the previous described generations, we end up with this, which is actually really surprising, because if you were to look at that, you would pretty much say that's just the actual photograph, but it isn't. If you look at it side by side with the actual photograph, there are very subtle differences. Like the eye line is not the same. Obviously, there are more wrinkles on the Midjourney output. The Midjourney output has an overall like HDR kind of look to it as well, but I think that could be toned down in Photoshop. But it was just surprising to me because that's the first time that I've ever seen something come out so accurate from an image prompt. I mean, it's practically the same image. And I would bet that if you were walking down the street, stopped 10 people and just showed them the Midjourney output, they would probably say, yeah, that's the famous photo, isn't it? I don't know. It's pretty crazy. So just out of curiosity, that was in 5.1 raw. So I took the same image prompt and same prompt and ran it in 5.1 regular, the more creative version of 5.1. And these were the images that we got, which are still extremely close. This gets in line, I think, closer to the idea of using Midjourney as an engine to create alternate angles to images that exist. There are still some problems here, like this kid is a clone of mom. But this image, I think with a little more work and taking some of the ideas that we used in Lunch Atop a Skyscraper, you might be able to fool people into thinking that this was like a seventh photo that Dorthea Lange took that day in 1938. This is Ansel Adams' Monolith, the half face of dome. One of his most famous photographs, and was shot at Yosemite National Park in 1927. It is stunning. It's unfortunate that Ansel's work has become so synonymous with doctors' waiting rooms or sort of benign desktop wallpaper that it's easy to forget what a masterfully composed, technically brilliant, and just downright patient photo this really is. Adams hiked for half a day for this photograph, carrying 40 pounds of camera gear on his back. And I think the elevation here is like 3,500 feet. So yeah, he hiked up carrying all of that stuff. And even when he got there, he spent time experimenting with different filters and ultimately ended up waiting 2.5 hours for the sun to be in the right position for this photo. I typed some words into Midjourney. What are you gonna do? So Describe actually didn't call out Ansel Adams, which was surprising to me considering how iconic this photo is. The results that it did return to us were interesting. This was very nice. It was very reminiscent of the Mac OS Yosemite default wallpaper. We did end up with this bizarre one, which kind of looks like the set of an 80s sci-fi B movie. Some other interesting ones, kind of a bridge to nowhere sort of thing. Ultimately though, I don't think that you ever really attain what you're looking for unless you use your initial image as an image prompt. In this case, we finally did end up with something that more or less resembled Ansel Adams' work. But even as it succeeds, it also kind of fails. Like, I think it did a really good job of capturing the overall tone of the sky. That's actually a technique that Ansel used by putting a red filter over the camera lens when shooting black and white. It kind of blocks the red light spectrum and causes that really nice, deep, saturated color. But it fails on the textures of the mountain itself. To me, it doesn't track as realistic. It kind of has a video game, like Unreal Engine kind of quality to it. Even though I think actually Unreal Engine has gotten even better than this. So I can't necessarily even say that. But I do have a potential fix for this. So once again, just by taking some sections of the original photograph, copying them, and then pasting them on. In this case, I used the soft light mode here. And then this side was kind of problematic. So I dropped another one there. Once again, soft light, both at 100%. It kind of now buys just a little bit more. So with just some very basic edits, we now have something that I think you could print out, hang up in a doctor's office, and sadly people would just continue to ignore. Going back to the 90 Miles project, I did get to thinking, what about photographs of historical events from different vantage points? Weirdly enough, I started with JFK. So I was at a buddy's house a couple nights ago, and for some reason, Oliver Stone's JFK was on TV, and I caught some bits and pieces of it. And so I think that was sort of in my head. I also think that when I started thinking historical events from different vantage points, immediately the grassy knoll popped into my head, but I didn't want to go in that direction. So instead, I just went with the presidential motorcade, which gave me some difficulty. A lot of the initial images either had Kennedy driving the car itself. In this image, there was a ghost driver. It would often forget Jackie Kennedy, and in this case, apparently, they are also in the UK as the driver's on the wrong side, or in this image where it's JFK sort of partying and there's a drunk frat boy in the backseat. Taking a page from Dorthea Lange, I began to switch up the prompting and moved into a close-up, which resulted in this image, which I actually think is pretty good. There are some problems where it kind of has a wax figure sort of look to it, but let's see if we can't dial that out in Photoshop. So in this case, I just made it black and white and turned up the grain a bit, and then ultimately ended up adding a level of 35mm film grain to it, and then lastly applied another filter to it, which led us to this image, which I think actually looks pretty on point. I don't know, you guys let me know, does that actually look like a legitimate picture of John F. Kennedy, or can you still see AI within it? Keeping on with the theme of assassinated presidents, so I'm looking forward to seeing the FBI at my house later tonight. We moved over to Lincoln. I thought it'd be an interesting idea to see if we could get a photograph of Lincoln at the Gettysburg Address. So I always thought that there wasn't an image of Lincoln giving the Gettysburg Address, but in researching how I was going to tackle this image, I found there is a photo of him giving the Gettysburg Address. It's this photo, which is not very good. So let's see if we can do a better job of capturing this moment in history using Midjourney. As a side note, I also learned that there are 150 photographs of Abraham Lincoln. That's a number that sort of surprises me. I don't know if it should be higher or lower. It just sort of surprises me that there are 150 photos of Lincoln. A lot of the images of Lincoln were shot on the daguerreotype style of camera. In my initial prompt, I tried out a photo of Abraham Lincoln, Gettysburg Address, daguerreotype, quarter plate, and ended up with these images, which that's not quite what I was looking for. Moving over to a photo of Abraham Lincoln addressing a large crowd of Union soldiers, Gettysburg Address, daguerreotype, aged photo, got us this, which looks okay, but doesn't really pass for reality to me. The crowd is far too large. There's a giant amphitheater in that fourth image. Yeah, it just doesn't buy for me. So what was surprising to me was taking that original image of the Gettysburg Address out of focus, blurry and poorly composed as it is, and running it as an image prompt along with my prompt, which resulted in this image, which I actually feel kind of works. Ultimately, there was still the problem that if you zoom in, he's kind of got that Midjourney distorted facial feature thing happening. Luckily for us, of the 150 photos that Lincoln was in, we actually do have a profile shot. So taking this photo and just cutting out his face, flopping it around, and then applying it to our Midjourney image, we get this, which I actually think kind of works. I probably should have spent a little more time matching the skin tones there, but I think it more or less works. And then if you beat the whole thing up a little bit and get to here, I think you've got something that might fool people. I think there probably is a level of grain that I probably should throw over his face and maybe blur it a little bit more, but I would say it's 90% there. I don't know. You guys let me know. Do you think this is passable? Do you think that if you were just to show this to a couple of random people, they would say, yep, that's Lincoln giving the Gettysburg Address? So what's this all mean? Can we no longer trust anything we see? Do we really live in a post-truth world? Well, yes and no. I mean, honestly, photo manipulation has been around for a while now. And to be honest, there's nothing that we did today that couldn't have been accomplished by Photoshop over the last 20 years. And as far as the truth and reality of a photo, well, all photos are a manipulation of reality. Any event photographer can make the most boring party in the world look like the biggest banger, or a wedding look like a funeral, all through shot composition, shot selection, and post-processing. Dorthea Lange posed those kids in what is now considered to be one of the greatest photos of all time. There's never truth in an image. There never has been. As a medium, photography is less than 200 years old, which actually makes it pretty young in terms of the arts. AI imagery is what, 2 now? I mean, it's an infant. It's not even an infant, it's a newborn. And like with all newborns, we do have to be careful with it, but if we raise it right, it might just grow up to be an incredible artist. Hey, thank you for watching. I think this one ran pretty long, so I really do appreciate you sticking around to the end. My name's Tim. We'll see you soon.